Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak and for the introduction. So I'm going to talk about some methodological considerations in platform trials and a little bit about federated trials, which is the topic I was given that I had to read up about a little bit. I'm a co-PI for the CPEC platform, which is with François Lamontagne, a platform of usual care interventions among critically ill patients. I'll start with an introduction, which is going to be repetitive, so maybe I'll skip through that quickly. I'll talk a little bit about classic trial designs versus federated designs, and I'll use as an example something recently published that's not in critical care. I'll address some of the issues that Danny brought up and John also talked about around efficiency in platform trials and what we know about that so far, and a little bit about some design considerations and maybe some areas for caution. Okay, so the randomized controlled trial really emerged to answer questions about which interventions worked. And back before the randomized trial, when lots of therapies were being sold to patients with very little evidence, this was seen as a major advance. And we've talked about some of the limitations of standard two-arm randomized trials and why they produce uncertain results and why many people became frustrated by them. And this slide doesn't talk about the fact that randomized trials traditionally don't align with the way clinicians see patients who've got to make 9 decisions and they've only got a trial maybe addressing one of them. But even standard trials with 2 groups had very small sample sizes relative to what was needed to provide a reliable answer. They were very slow to enroll. There was arguments about whether the control group was appropriate, and they were expensive. And many people designed 2-arm randomized controlled trials thinking that they were investigating the medical equivalent of a parachute, which is a very large effect intervention like blood transfusion for hemorrhage and insulin for diabetes and so on. But most interventions aren't like that. And so within the standard model of trials, one approach has been to get to a very large N to generate certainty, and that's shown in the example on the right. There's been a lot written about traditional trials versus platform trials. Just on the issue of talking about federated trials shortly, I just want to focus on the last box here, which is the traditional trial has a single sponsor, either of maybe a federal funder or an industry sponsor, but a platform trial has the flexibility to be supported by multiple sponsors, and that, or a combination of sponsors, and that brings together a lot of flexibility. In a platform trial, you need to have a master protocol. This is shown on the bottom right of the screen here, where we've got a population, and we've got a standard of care, and then maybe a couple of interventions, and we go through some interim analyses, and we drop some arms that don't seem to be working, and at the end of at the final analysis, we're able to say something about the remaining interventions in the trial. And many platform trials, not all of them, but many of them incorporate features of adaptation. So instead of just running the trial and finishing it and analyzing it, somewhere in the middle you can make some changes. And that may be to refine the sample size, it may be to drop treatment arms, it may be to change the allocation ratio. So instead of randomizing 1 patient to new intervention, 1 patient to control, you're changing that ratio. You may be adapting the inclusion criteria. You may be running analyses within the trial to say, okay, these patients that have very low respiratory compliance, very stiff lungs, are more likely to benefit from this intervention. So we're going to drop the non-stiff lung patients from this particular domain or this particular intervention, only randomize those with stiff lungs. And you can also adapt by stopping the entire trial early, which is also shared with standard trials. So that's sort of the platform trial with the various ways of adapting it that's been described so far. What does the federated design refer to? Well, federated learning is a big concept in observational research with nothing to do with trials. This is an example from a paper talking about how to use imaging data to derive some associations between what you see on imaging and what the final diagnosis is. What's an example of that? Let's look at 1,000 breast ultrasounds and figure out which features predict patients that ultimately have breast cancer. Let's look at chest x-rays and figure out, who has ARDS. And In federated observational learning, instead of a model where all of the data from 3 institutions goes to a common data set, and then there's some learning that happens from that, and maybe that's regression, or maybe it's machine learning. Instead, you've got each institution keeping their own data, some model that's being run on each institution's data without the data ever leaving that institution. And then the model weights get updated based on the results from each institution's data. You can think of it as a meta-analysis of the weights from each institution's data. But this has major advantages in that, at least for imaging and other situations where you don't have to worry about privacy considerations that otherwise would completely scupper this approach. In Canada, Michael Chassé has done a lot of work developing the CODA platform, which is using hospital-based data to basically generate a province-wide electronic record that can be used for research insights. So the data don't leave the initial hospitals. There's an orchestration hub that sort of creates this code that runs on each of the sites, and the end users it can be used for quality improvement and in addition to research. So that's sort of federated research for observational data, and there's a huge amount of work being done on that. What about for randomized trials? Well, even for a platform, you can think of a platform that has a single sponsor, and there's a number of advantages to that. There's a reason why single sponsor is easier, right? You generate consistency because it's the same people involved in the governance of the trial, in the monitoring, in the data management, and in the accountability. Versus in a federated trial, you have independent trials that are addressing common clinical research questions in such a fashion that it supports regulatory submissions. And why has this become popular, particularly during pandemic or epidemic research? There's a lot of flexibility here in startup and in managing various challenges related to budgets, and most importantly, in the era before funding agencies are working together, it allows for country-specific funding applications and asynchronous starts. And I think also that having a local ownership of some individual trial that is contributing to a federated analysis or a conjoined analysis may also improve motivation by people thinking that they're contributing to something that has local provenance rather than something that is run from elsewhere. Here's an example that's just been published in eClinical Medicine looking at an antiviral tecovirimat for Mpox. And there was a WHO core protocol for this problem. And in Europe, the MPX response funded 3 trials, Unity, MOSA, and Epoxy, in 3 different jurisdictions. And there were a number of other trials funded as well. But the idea was that they were based on a common core protocol. And if you look at multiple approaches to one research question, and you look at the Mpox example, and they had the international single trial over here versus the federated trial design, the key thing is that although there may be differences between each of the trials, there were elements that were the same based on a common core protocol. And so even if the eligibility criteria were a bit different, for the conjoined analysis, sort of like conjoined twins, I guess, but for the conjoined analysis, you had to agree on the analysis set from each trial that would be based on common eligibility criteria. So let's say, and they pointed out in the example here, there were different age ranges, but for the conjoined analysis, they decided, and I don't have the numbers exactly right, but they decided they were going to analyze a particular range for the joint analysis, but trials would report independently on the younger or older patients. Similarly, for primary and secondary outcomes in an international single trial or international single platform, they have to be totally uniform, and there's one sample size calculation for the trial. But for the federated design, again, as long as there's some overlap between the outcomes, it doesn't really matter what you call them, right? One outcome could be primary in one trial and secondary in the other, as long as the outcomes were collected in all trials, you could analyze them together. And the sample size could also be described independently in each trial. That didn't really matter, as long as there was a clear description of the combined sample size and the interim analyses. And finally, from point of view of randomization, statistics, and analysis population, again, based on a common core protocol. Data safety and quality, I think this is where the differences are the most important, because instead of centralized data monitoring, funding, and ethics submission, there's local ownership with respect to data quality, funding the trial, and in conducting the trial within each jurisdiction. And what this allows for is, at least in this example, it allowed for a lot shorter startup time and time to completion. The use of either multi-platform trials, which have been talked about, or this federated design leads to very complex organizational diagrams. So in this example here, there was a common data safety monitoring board and data repository. Each of the 3 trials had their own trial steering committee, their own sponsor, their own local stakeholders, regulatory and ethics considerations, but they were all able to work together, partly because there was a common DSMB. Hiroki Sato, who's in Japan, was a fellow in Toronto, has done a lot for Remap CAP in Japan, and also is leading sort of educational initiatives within the practical platform, has developed this complex diagram as part of a paper he's working on for the multi-platform approach, just illustrating that for there's three platforms, they managed to function in a federated manner to answer the question of anticoagulation for patients with severe COVID-19. Now, this particular diagram doesn't talk about the DSMB issues, but in theory, the efficacy reports from and the safety reports from each of the 3 trials were going to each of the separate DSMBs, and eventually they all came to one conclusion based on pre-planned stopping rules that drove the collaboration. I was also involved in something that in retrospect one might call semi-federated. At the time we call it harmonized, just to ensure that the language would never be consistent. This was two trials of vitamin C for COVID-19. One was the smaller Levitt COVID trial, which was a Frequentis trial that was funded in Canada using funding from a private foundation. And then there was the much larger Remap CAP vitamin C domain. This collaboration was made possible, and really sort of a collaboration of convenience, by the fact that Francois Lamontagne and I were co-PIs of both the Levitt COVID trial and the vitamin C domain in Remap CAP. And therefore, we were able to mostly harmonize the vitamin C outcomes, the vitamin C regimen, the outcomes, and the analysis. So the vitamin C was the same, but we just went differently on the use of placebo in Levitt COVID and no vitamin C in Remap CAP. The randomization systems were different. The sample sizes were completely differently calculated. And in Remap CAP was based on their statistical stopping rules. And just as on monitoring and analysis here, we did not function in a federated manner. There were separate DSMCs. Our methods of communicating from one DMC to another were not based on a charter, but we basically gave each chair each other's emails and said, please communicate. And the decision to stop was ultimately based only on the much larger Remap CAP data set for vitamin C. After the fact, not really before the fact, but after the fact, there was a process of data harmonization and the transfer of the Levitt COVID data to the Remap CAP Method Center and analysis using the Remap CAP model. So this is not a true federated model, but I think it has some elements of it. It was planned a lot later. It was harmonization mostly after the fact, or partly after the fact rather than before, but it did work to give an answer to the particular question that was asked. Okay, I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking a little bit about some methodological issues with adaptive platform trials. There's been some work asking about what are the efficiency gains, and particularly over the long term. And it turns out that it really depends. This is a simulation study. It really depends what you're modeling here. If you look on the left here with a platform trial, a bunch of interventions in one common control group. And then you look at another scenario where you've got a multi-group trial, so 5 interventions, 1 control group, and then subsequently you add in 5 other interventions, each with their own control group. It turns out, which sounds very complicated to do in a standard fashion, but it turns out that this multi-group approach here turns out to be more efficient, so fewer person years to set up and cheaper compared to the platform trial, right? But if you wanted to do, which is mostly what people were doing before platform trials came along, 10 trials of 10 interventions versus 10 control groups, the platform trial clearly wins out here, right? So I think the point to make here is that even in theory, whether platform trials end up being more efficient, faster to set up, it is not sort of clear. It kind of depends what you're comparing them to. And it may be that the gains of the platform trial are only in the longer run when you're on your 10th intervention using the same platform and all of the infrastructure that you've put in from the beginning is just motoring along and you're not having to invest much further in that. In terms of actual efficiency gains, this is a paper, a systematic review that reviewed 127 platform trials that had been completed as of July of 2022. And at the time of this review, which was 2 years later, only half of them had reported results. Versus a different systematic review, about 80% of trials had reported results that had been trials that were launched in 2016 with the results available by 2024. Within a year of that, about 80% of them had reported results. Now, this clearly isn't driven by, I don't think, by critical care trials during the pandemic, which reported very quickly. But there are clearly some platform trials that may be struggling here. And so it's not necessarily a guarantee that because you're a platform trial, you're going to do what you say you're going to do, which is potentially a bit problematic. And I think it's also very important to note that during the COVID pandemic, I think what I think is a great triumph of the recovery trial in the UK was probably not related to adaptive features, but it was related to the setup of the health system where, as John pointed out, it was a learning health system. Sites are actually incentivized to do research. They're rewarded for that. And as there was, I thought it was higher, but it turns out about 11% of hospitalized patients in the UK were enrolled in recovery. And the corresponding number in Canada for Remap Cap, which is probably the largest platform that was enrolling in Canada at the time, was around 4% of ICU patients, so a lot smaller. But this is really because recovery had a large, simple trial model and a health system that was set up for success. So the advantages of the UK system were very simple eligibility criteria, coordinated health infrastructure. They did have some features that platform trials use, such as multiple arms with a shared control group. But I think many people have argued that the real success here had to do with the healthcare infrastructure, the large, simple trial approach, the link to administrative data sets, as opposed to being a platform trial per se. I think it's also important to note that some people have written about this, that efficiency in platform trials may come at the expense, particularly when things are done quickly, of some aspects that are considered important to the ethical conduct of trials. These authors thought that consent forms during the pandemic were maybe not fully sufficient. I mean, you could argue that maybe the standards are incorrect, but there's at least some debate as to whether consent forms were inadequate during the pandemic with respect to platform trials. I think one other important point about platforms is that, and this has been alluded to earlier, is that currently the platform trials in the COVID pandemic were really not really representative of the world's population or of patients that got COVID. And there is a fair bit of effort, at least with respect to hypoxemic respiratory failure, of designing a platform that will ensure that there's more representativeness. As John has alluded to, this is taking a long time to get going, and I think we'll only know in about 5 years or so whether this has been a successful venture. I'm going to skip through non-concurrent controls in the interest of time and just talk about response adaptive randomization and our own experience with this. So this is one of the ways that adaptive platform trials can adapt, is to change the proportion of patients in each arm according to how each arm is doing. So in this interim analysis here, intervention 2 is doing better than intervention 1, and therefore more patients get allocated to intervention 2. The benefits of this are that when you present this scenario to patients, they're more likely to want to be in a trial where there's response adaptive randomization, even though there's no incomplete understanding of what it means, even after it's explained. There are some drawbacks here having to do with temporal trends that are hard to model, and some creation of statistical inefficiencies in effect estimation where you deviate from 1 to 1. And this actually led to a situation in the vitamin C remap cap domain where vitamin C was looking good initially, this is in red compared to blue, but then midway through it sort of flipped, and vitamin C looked like it was harmful relative to control, which is ultimately what the trial found. But because of a very long delay between 2 analysis periods, which had to do with complexities of data transfer, the exact opposite of what was designed to happen actually happened, meaning that in the critically ill state, more patients ended up getting randomized to vitamin C compared to control. So it just shows you that when you do response adaptive randomization, I think it's super important to build in necessary safeguards to prevent this kind of scenario from happening, which was, I'd say, pretty unfortunate. So I'm going to stop here. Regardless of the design, the objective of every trial, whether it's a standard trial, a platform trial, and within a platform trial, whether it's federated or single sponsors, to produce a reliable and interpretable answer to an important research question. There's no question that platform trials offer an efficient solution to studying multiple treatments for a given condition, and I would say that the federated approach allows for added flexibility in a funding environment that's very complex. And a regulatory environment that doesn't allow for simultaneous startup. But you have to consider the trade-offs of platform trials and adaptive features, and don't assume that they're necessarily going to deliver you the results that you want. I think whether these work and how we can improve them is going to require several more years of experience. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.